The announcement itself took less than a minute to read, but the work behind it stretched across years. Starting the moment a team of more than 50 scientists and engineers began rebuilding from the ground up the single document that decides how strong every new building in America has to be. And that release was just the opening scene. Over the following months, the numbers inside it began propagating outward into building codes, into insurance rate structures, into public policy in states that had never seriously considered earthquakes at all. By the time we're done here, you'll understand exactly which parts of the country had their risk revised upward, why the biggest surprises are nowhere near California, and what a hazard map can and absolutely cannot tell you. The United States Geological Survey released the 2023 50-state update to the National Seismic Hazard Model. It was requested by Congress. It is the first time in the history of the country that the conterminous United States, Alaska, and Hawaii were all assessed together in one unified model. And the headline finding was this: nearly 75% of the United States could experience damaging earthquake shaking. Not California, not the West Coast, 3/4 of the country. New tools and new technology identified nearly 500 additional faults capable of producing a damaging earthquake, faults that were not on the previous map because nobody had the resolution to see them. 37 states have experienced earthquakes exceeding magnitude 5 in the last 200 years, and the specific regions where the model showed the possibility of more damaging shaking than previously understood include the central and northeastern Atlantic coastal corridor, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Today we are going to break down exactly what is going on, where it is most dangerous, and whether things could get even worse. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the science, and the real stakes. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever personally felt an earthquake somewhere people said earthquakes do not happen? Tell me where you were and what it felt like. I read every single one. If you want to be the first to know every time something major happens, subscribe. It is completely free. A thumbs up also helps enormously. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one so the algorithm actually shows it to the people who need to see it. Now let us get into it. Let us start with what this document actually is, because almost nobody outside the engineering world understands how consequential it is. The National Seismic Hazard Model is not a prediction. It is not a forecast of when an earthquake will happen. What it does is define the potential for earthquake ground shaking at various probability levels across the entire country, and that output is applied directly in the seismic provisions of building codes, in insurance rate structures, in risk assessments, and in public policy. Read that again, because it is the reason this matters more than almost any scientific document you will hear about this year. When the value on this map goes up for your city, the building code eventually goes up with it. Every new hospital, school, bridge, and apartment tower designed after adoption has to be built stronger. The map is the number that becomes the rebar. And before 2023, that map was badly out of date in most of the country. The conterminous United States had last been comprehensively updated in 2018. Alaska had last been updated in 2007. Hawaii had last been updated in 1998, with a partial revision around 2001. Hawaii's model was, in other words, 25 years old. It predated the entire modern era of GPS geodesy on the islands, the 2018 Kilauea eruption and its associated seismic unrest, and multiple generations of ground motion science. That changed fast. Mark Peterson, the USGS geophysicist who led the study, described what the rebuild involved: more faults, better characterized land surfaces, and computational advances in modeling that produced the most detailed view ever of the earthquake risks the country faces. He also called it a massive multi-year collaborative effort between federal, state, and local governments and the private sector. The technical inputs give you a sense of how much was rebuilt. New earthquake catalogs deliberately excluding induced earthquakes, that is, the human-caused seismicity from wastewater injection that distorted hazard numbers in places like Oklahoma, alternative declustering methods for separating main shocks from aftershocks, spatially smoothed seismicity, new fault and deformation models built from both geologic evidence and geodetic measurement, improved ground motion models drawing on the NGA subduction project and revised NGA East and NGA West 2 models. That last piece, ground motion models, is where a great deal of the change came from, and it is the part almost every news story skipped. To put that in context, a hazard map is built from two entirely separate halves. The first half is the earthquake rupture forecast, where the faults are, how fast they are loading, how big a rupture each one can produce, and how often. That is the part people imagine when they think of a hazard map. The second half is the ground motion model. Given that an earthquake of a certain size happens at a certain place, how hard does the ground actually shake at your address? That depends on distance, on the type of rock the waves travel through, and critically on the soil sitting directly underneath your foundation. You can leave the faults completely unchanged and still move a city's hazard number substantially just by improving the second half. And that is a large part of what happened along the East Coast. Now, here is the part that surprises almost everyone. Most Americans assume the eastern United States is seismically boring because it does not sit on a plate boundary. That is true. There is no San Andreas running through Pennsylvania. Eastern earthquakes are intraplate events occurring on ancient faults buried inside the middle of the North American plate, and they are genuinely less frequent than Western ones. But frequency is not the same thing as consequence. and the eastern United States has a geological property that changes the math entirely. The crust in the western United States is geologically young, hot, and heavily fractured. Seismic waves traveling through it lose energy quickly. They scatter off fracture networks and get absorbed. Shaking dies out over relatively short distances. The crust in the eastern United States is the opposite. It is ancient, cold, and structurally intact. A continuous, dense basement of rock that has been sitting there, relatively undisturbed for hundreds of millions of years. Seismic energy travels through it with remarkable efficiency. Instead of dissipating over tens of miles, it carries over hundreds. The practical translation is blunt. An eastern earthquake affects a dramatically larger area than a western earthquake of the same magnitude. And on April 5th, 2024, less than 3 months after the new model was released, the country got an unplanned demonstration of exactly that principle. At 10:23 in the morning Eastern Time, a magnitude 4.8 earthquake struck Tewksbury Township, New Jersey, at a depth of only 4.7 kilometers, about 2.9 miles. It was the strongest New Jersey earthquake since 1783. By any Western standard, a magnitude 4.8 is a minor event. In Southern California, a 4.8 generates a news segment and a few cracked windows. More than 180,000 people submitted reports to the USGS Did You Feel It system. That was the largest number of responses to that tool for any earthquake in its history. The shaking was felt from Quebec to Georgia and into the Midwest. Tremors lasting several seconds were reported more than 200 miles away near the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border. Estimates put the number of people who felt it at more than 42 million across 14 states, a magnitude 4.8, 42 million people. In Manhattan, roughly 65 kilometers from the epicenter, it interrupted a United Nations Security Council meeting and delayed a New York Philharmonic performance. Emergency alerts went out across the metropolitan area. 911 centers across New Jersey were inundated with calls. The damage notably was limited. Up to 150 buildings in New York City reported some damage. There was significant damage to a historic masonry building in Lebanon, New Jersey. A water main broke in Randolph. A vehicle fell into a sinkhole in Huntington, New York. Gas leaks were reported in Rockland County and Morristown. There were no severe injuries. And here is the detail seismologists found genuinely interesting. The damage near the epicenter was less severe than expected. A paper in the Seismic Record noted that for a magnitude 4.8 in the central and eastern United States, the expected shaking near the source would be modified Mercalli intensity 7, day, very strong shaking. The observed maximum intensity was 6. Why the discrepancy matters is the reason the ground motion half of the model got rebuilt. New Jersey's subsurface is not simple. Beneath it sit sedimentary structures hundreds of millions of years old. The Paleozoic Appalachian Foreland Basin west of the modern Appalachians, running from Canada to Alabama, and the Newark Basin, a rift basin formed during the Mesozoic when Pangaea tore apart. And along the coast lies the Atlantic coastal plain, where soft sediments sit directly on hard basement rock. That specific pairing, soft sediment over hard rock, does two opposite things at once. It attenuates short-period ground motion, the high-frequency shaking that rattles small, stiff structures, and it amplifies long-period ground motion. Long-period ground motion is what tall buildings respond to. New York City has a great many tall buildings. Now let us talk about what this actually means for people, because this is where a map turns into a human outcome. The difference between a damaging earthquake and a catastrophic one is almost never the earthquake. It is the building stock, and the building stock is a direct product of what the code required on the day it was built. California has been designing for earthquakes for the better part of a century. After the 1933 Long Beach earthquake, the state passed the Field Act mandating seismic standards for school construction. Decades of iteration followed. After San Fernando in 1971, after Loma Prieta in 1989, after Northridge in 1994. Every one of those disasters produced code revisions. That is why California carries a 95% or greater probability of damaging shaking within a century and still expects to survive it standing. The Northeast has no equivalent history because it has had no equivalent disasters in living memory. Boston's brick row houses, Philadelphia's 19th century masonry, New York's pre-war walk-ups, Washington's historic core, enormous quantities of unreinforced masonry, built beautifully, built to last, and built with precisely zero consideration of lateral seismic force, because at the time, no engineer had reason to consider it and no code required it. Unreinforced masonry is the single most lethal common building type in earthquakes worldwide. Brick and stone are extraordinarily strong in compression and nearly worthless in tension. Shake the wall sideways and the mortar joints fail. The wall peels away from the floors it was supporting. And this is the part that must be said clearly, because it is the limitation of the entire enterprise. Updating a hazard map does absolutely nothing to a building that already exists. The map raises the design requirement going forward. It does not retrofit a single brownstone. Codes apply to new construction and to major renovations. In a region where much of the building stock predates the automobile, the map changing and the risk changing are two very different things happening on two very different timescales. Compounding it, earthquake insurance penetration in the United States is remarkably low. Standard homeowners policies do not cover earthquake damage anywhere in the country. In regions with no earthquake culture, almost nobody buys the separate coverage because nobody believes they need it. The difference between a manageable event and a generational one is not luck. It is whether the code was written before the buildings went up. So what are engineers and scientists watching now that this model exists? The first thing is adoption. A hazard model does not automatically become law. It flows into engineering standards, which flow into model building codes, which then have to be adopted jurisdiction by jurisdiction, state by state, sometimes city by city. That process takes years, and in places without political urgency around earthquakes, it can stall entirely. The gap between the best available science and the code actually enforced in a given county is where real risk lives. The second is the 500 newly identified faults. Each one of those is a structure that existed the entire time and was simply invisible to earlier surveys. New tools, high-resolution LiDAR that strips away forest canopy to reveal fault scarps, improved seismic imaging, dense GPS networks measuring millimeter-scale crustal deformation are still being deployed. There is no reason to believe 500 is the final number. The next update will find more. The third is the regions that were already known and remain the largest single-event threats in the interior of the country. The New Madrid seismic zone, spanning parts of Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky, produced a sequence of very large earthquakes in 1811 and 1812 in a region now home to millions of people and critical national infrastructure. The Charleston, South Carolina zone produced a major destructive earthquake in 1886. Both sit in that efficient eastern crust. Both are surrounded by building stock that has never been tested. Keep an eye on Hawaii, too. The 2023 model characterizes the islands as having greater potential for shaking than previously assessed, driven by observations from recent volcanic eruptions and seismic unrest. That is a 25-year-old assessment being brought forward into the present, and the revision went upward. And keep an eye on the induced seismicity question. The 2023 model deliberately excluded induced earthquakes from its catalogs, which is methodologically correct for a long-term model. Human-caused seismicity can start and stop with regulatory decisions in a way tectonic faults cannot. But USGS produces separate short-term forecasts for those regions precisely because the hazard there is real. In parts of Oklahoma and Texas, the near-term shaking risk is not primarily a function of geology at all. It is a function of what is being injected underground this year. So let us close this honestly. The map does not mean an earthquake is coming. This is a time-independent probabilistic model, meaning it deliberately makes no statement about when. It does not know whether your region's next significant earthquake is next year or in 4 centuries. The USGS states the limitation on its own pages in plain language. No one can predict earthquakes. What existing faults and past earthquakes give us is information about where and how large, not when. And the 75% figure deserves a caveat that almost no headline included. Damaging in this context spans an enormous range. The USGS description runs from minor cracks in walls to potential building collapses. 3/4 of the country facing the possibility of damaging shaking within a century does not mean 3/4 of the country will be destroyed. It means that over a 100-year horizon, most of America has some meaningful chance of an earthquake strong enough to crack plaster somewhere. The risk in the ground did not increase in 2023. Not one fault started moving faster because a report was published. What increased was the accuracy of the estimate. A higher number on a map is not the planet getting more dangerous. It is us finally seeing what was always there. But here is the real danger, and it is not the 75% statistic. The danger is the gap. It is the distance between a model that now says the ground beneath Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Washington can shake harder than we thought, and a building stock in those same cities that was raised brick by unreinforced brick on the assumption that it never would. The West Coast has spent 90 years closing that gap with money, code, and hard-won memory. The East Coast has barely started because it has never been given a reason it could feel. For 42 million people on April 5th, 2024, that reason lasted about 30 seconds. And then it stopped, and almost everyone went back to work. Drop a comment below. Have you ever felt an earthquake somewhere they supposedly do not happen? Do you know when your building was built? Tell me where you were and what it felt like. I read every single one. If this taught you something you did not know about the ground under your own city, hit the thumbs up. We are going for 5,000 likes, so the algorithm shows this to the people who most need to see it. Subscribe if you want to be first to know every time something significant happens. Let us go. See you in the next one.